So thank you very much. What I'd like to do is ask all of the speakers from the day to come up, and they're actually still mostly here, which is really kind of weird. Did y'all come together in a big old van or something? So come on up, and we'll have some question and answer period until we try to dismiss at about 4. So give us a minute. We'll see how many are still here. I counted 12, but so we might be short. Get off the hook. I know.
That's half the audience is up there.
No, I'm so apologies.
Yeah.
I didn't think there'd be more than 800.
We'll get through the questions.
Some of you can just sit on the front of the stage and swing your hands. We'll make it work. You want to tap the microphones and see if I see green lights over there, so he must be good. All right, so question and answer time. And just so you know, we've actually had about 14 offices join us via live stream throughout the day, which is kind of cool. So thank you. Hello, everybody out there. Oh, hello, everybody out there. However that works. So questions. What I will do is repeat the question and direct it to someone, just to kind of, there you go, just to kind of streamline some things. So first question, Sue.
Yeah, going back to the last talk, and Christine and Catherine, I'm wondering if, you talked about trying to incorporate processes and gap creation and stuff, and yet you were also talking about, trying to deal with some of your disease pockets and stuff, and I'm wondering if there was any consideration about incorporating disease and root rot as far as maintaining those processes and gap creation. Realizing that busting out of some of these paradigms is a big management challenge, maybe that was a step you weren't quite ready to go, but I'm wondering how that played into your process.
So I'll repeat the question by saying, can you convince anyone that natural processes that create death are okay? And do you really need to, how do we manage with that process for good?
Well, we did include our existing, ongoing and future mortality patches into a lot of those unthinned areas. We're not just maintaining live old trees in that 10 to 15%, and we've actually increased it a little bit. I was trying to focus mostly on the critical habitat piece where we don't have a lot of that mortality going on yet, but in the rest of the project area, we are maintaining a significant portion, maybe upwards to 20% of those snag patches that we have to keep that disease kind of going, because we do understand it's, a natural process. And then that also lends itself to, you have those legacy components of those large snags, and then that early seral development coming in underneath.
And I'll just add to that I think there's something of a communication challenge here because, to the extent that there's uncharacteristically high levels of disease or insects, we probably do want to encourage going back towards that more historic level. So if we say, you want to keep some of these on the landscape, we need to be very sure that we're communicating it clearly that, it's those historic levels. It's not, because I think sometimes when we as the Fish and Wildlife Service representative talk, people hear something that, we say, well, we want you to keep those on the landscape, and they hear, you mean, you want us to keep it exactly how it is right now? And that's not really what we want to see.
Anyone else want to add to that? Okay, thank you, Sue. Next question? Yes.
This is to Jan, Christine, Catherine also, but maybe other folks, I don't know. But you mentioned that you had these large legacy leftover trees, legacy trees that were escaped the logging from the previous centuries, and they weren't snags; they were still alive. Is that correct? So most of them were still alive. I'm wondering if you incorporated any kind of treatments, pre-treatments, because you also said prescribed fire was part of
So how are you going to protect your large trees that survived the railroad logging from your prescribed fire?
I can send you our resource protection measures, but we did exactly what you just said. We have measures in there for, raking away the duff, especially around those larger pine, as well as just tree well burning, in those cool season burns as well. So.
Grady?
Question for maybe Brian or Jim or somebody from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. I was just curious about the critical habitat mapping process. The tool was used in creating the maps, and why that wasn't applied to wilderness areas.
So how did you consider wilderness areas when you did the CHU mapping?
When we did the modeling and comparison of different outcomes, we did look at wilderness areas. Where wilderness areas sometimes, and in this rule, they didn't actually all come out of critical habitat, but in many cases, it boils down to that areas that require special protection. If you have an area that's already going to be managed as for natural conditions, the critical habitat rule or designation as critical habitat rule doesn't really buy you a lot. And this is something that is looked at differently in different regions from a legal perspective. But congressionally reserved areas are often left out of critical habitat designations because they don't really require that, added protection. And I know there's more nuance to it than that, but that's generally. But in the modeling process, they were like all other lands. And often large chunks of congressionally reserved areas or wilderness dropped out because even though they're wilderness and they're gorgeous, they're crummy owl habitat. In a lot of cases, we set them aside because they're beautiful and majestic and snowy and cold.
Do those maps exist though? Wilderness for me is a good baseline to see, where we come. I think it would be interesting to see if there was any of those critical habitats identified in wilderness.
Yeah, that's all mapped. That's all available in the map series. It shows where the different designations and the different reserve designs played out against all the different land allocations.
Yeah, I was going to add that I think the best way to look at that is to look at the relative habitat suitability map for the critical habitat process, because that shows you the value of the habitat, and those areas within wilderness areas will pop out when you look at it.
Yeah.
Dick?
This is somewhat of a follow-up to that, but I was wondering, to what extent local review and feedback was considered in influencing the final critical habitat designation?
So how much local feedback was taken into consideration as you designated the CHU? I know you kept my experimental forest in, so thank you very much.
Well,
But what other? Go ahead.
two of us will have to answer that because I worked on that process in the southern part of the range and not in the northern part of the range. We met with a wide range of people to get feedback, especially on the final rounds of mapped alternatives. And, we looked at map products that other units had already created as to where they thought their best areas were and why, met with a lot of the Forest Service biologists, down my way, mostly Forest Service biologists, and got a lot of feedback on the maps. And I mentioned that in my talk. There's this model-generated series of alternatives, and then you start focusing more of expert opinion on it because models don't see everything. They don't necessarily capture all the things that are going on in the landscape. And in Oregon and Washington, I think Betsy should speak to that.
Yes, I would say I think Lee and Bruce and Brendan and I spent quite a bit of time looking at specific areas but this is primarily in the Oregon area, at lands which would benefit from being in versus which would benefit from being out, and particularly in the checkerboard area where something may have come up as good in our relative habitat suitability map, But we have people who know much more what it's like on the ground, and I think we did spend a lot of time going through the different ownerships and land use allocations and making decisions based on expert opinion from all of you who work in the field. So there was a lot of input in all 3 states on that.
More questions? Cindy?
I really enjoyed this day. I really want to thank you all. It's just so fun to think all about spotted owls and habitat type today. But I did want to direct a question to you, Joe, with your work on Okanagan Wenatchee. And I was really interested in the process that you used to try to incorporate the landscape model and how you got to now a point where you're going out to and seeing how it's going to be implemented with the Wenatchee district. But I wondered how your assumptions on the future were accepted by stakeholders. Like, for example, you made an assumption that fire was going to be higher in the future. And I just wondered, did people kind of buy off on how your ecological rationale was?
It hasn't been challenged, I think, because of the size of the fires that we've experienced. We have not gone so far as to model the resilience of our landscape, assuming a certain type of climate change. Not yet, anyway. We may actually continue through with that before this EA hits the street, or perhaps for the BA. But in terms of the purpose and need for the project and the risk of fire, it's never been challenged. Never been questioned.
And the other assumptions that you made about the future, so you could kind of move forward with your project, those you didn't get any objections? That's
No,
great.
none at all whatsoever. I was really pleasantly surprised to see how few comments we've received about the proposed vegetation treatments. We did have a collaborative. We took a collaborative out on the ground. There were debates among our collaborative members, mostly about the number of large trees that would be removed to make sure we had viable commercial timber sales. We sort of sat back and listened to various representatives of the collaborative debate that back and forth. It was very informative for us. Yeah.
Yep. But that's it.
My question is for Joe. Do you, in the areas that you said you've had such large fires and recent and others have, that what was the percentage of high severity? And was it in already occupied or suitable NSO habitat when they burned?
Can you repeat that quickly, please?
Yes, you're asking about the large fires and the percentage of those areas that burned at what severity. There were many large fires, and my district actually, maybe it was a head and sand mentality, but we hadn't had any large fires up until 2012. And then the Table Mountain fire hit right next to the planning area that I was discussing this afternoon. And it was, there was quite a bit of high severity. We're resetting the baseline now for our project, and we're going to address the effects of that fire. And I've personally gone into some core areas that burned and found burned nest trees with tags. The good news is we still have dense canopy overstory trees in one very important core area, but we don't have any understory vegetation whatsoever. And so I went back out to that area with the level 1 representatives, and we all kicked the dirt and looked around. Is an owl going to use it in this condition? And we said, probably not, but we think it could recover suitability relatively quickly because we still got that large tree structure, and now we've got a nice pulse of dead wood.
Do you have plans to do any, or is there anybody looking at your area or some of these areas up in basically to the north of where I am, for the owl use of the burned areas? Have you seen, studies coming in for somebody wanting to come in and do some work in there?
So the question is about burned area use by spotted owls, and I think Jim can talk to that too.
Well, nothing specific, although on my district, because we're part of the long-term demography study and some of those known sites burned, we will be going in there. We basically monitor all known sites, occupied or unoccupied, and habitat is surveyed annually to see if there's ingress or egress of new birds. So it'll happen indirectly through that. Some of the demography study area burned.
Jim, you want to talk about Southwest Oregon and fire and owl sites? Yep.
There's, I'm sure you're familiar with the literature that's out there, Darren Clark and King and so forth, so I'm not sure what more I can add to that. Just want to make sure that folks are aware.
Well, southern, the Douglas complex, though, in the demographic study areas, they're continuing their monitoring, right?
I guess I didn't understand the question. So at least in southern Oregon, where the Douglas complex fire was, that's burned through the Klamath demography study area. And so they're out there doing surveys right now. It burned last year, and they're out surveying this year. So we'll be able to see what immediate post-occupancy is to some degree. And the BLM's got a large proposed action in there right now that we're working through consultation on.
The basically question was, the demographic study, we have long-term data, we have an opportunity to see if these areas have burned, and is there something that people will be able to read or know about or whatever from more data that is very valuable because of this long-term demography study that's attached to it? I feel like of all of the burn, owl use, burn data stuff that's out there that could have high value.
Yeah, and I think we have that opportunity, at least in the Douglas, because there's not a lot of long-term data out there. And so if they continue to monitor those sites, 3 to 5 years after that, that'll be incredibly valuable information, yeah.
How are they separating that though from the effects of barred owls? Because obviously some of these sites are going to unoccupied, and are we effectively being able to split out what might be the fire effect versus the barred owl effect in the site becoming unoccupied?
So can you tease out the effect of the barred owl versus the burn in terms of spotted owl occupancy later?
I'll get that one. So I think the way these data are analyzed, it's definitely possible to do that because it is such a long-term data set, and the sort of barred owl occupancy has been something that's been tracked over time. Something like a fire comes in, you can model that as sort of a one-time event. This thing happened in 2012, and then you can track the effects of that after it. And all of these studies are set up to do exactly that, so it shouldn't be a problem.
I'll say one thing about the fire issue. I know when I talked this morning, I mentioned it was nice to be working on spotted owls again and not sage grouse, but there's one general sort of, I think, commonality between these two species that I'm hearing a lot about, and that's there's two issues with fire for sage grouse and for spotted owls, and there's too much fire and not enough fire, and that's what all the ecologists keep saying about sage grouse. And so really it's a matter of, there's no sort of right answer. There's sort of restoring what I think you're doing or trying to do, restore some range of variability and then let it play out. But I'm worried if people think we can figure out precisely how to, like, what is good fire for owls and what's not. I think we're going to be challenged to do that, because that's definitely the way it's playing out with sage grouse too.
More questions? Yeah.
I have a question related to barred owls. I guess, Brian, right? Well, you're talking about the modeling and the barred owl influence, and how many acres would be reserved or set aside or managed as critical habitat. And varying the barred owl encounter rates made a big difference, and maybe even more than acres on that model. And so I've been reading comments, public comments have been coming in as to, what can we do? So from the BLM's perspective, what can you do about barred owls? Well, there's not much that a land management agency can do about barred owls, but I understand that you guys are in the process of doing some barred owl removal. So my moral thoughts on barred owl removal aside, what's the timeline on really aggressively going after these things and making a difference?
So repeat the question, whoever wants to do that.
Okay, so I guess that question probably comes to me. Looking at the timeline for barred owl removal, and in my presentation, I mentioned that the service had done an environmental impact statement for experimental removal of barred owls, and that was finalized last fall. So we had, within that EIS, we had a preferred alternative, which was looking at doing an experimental removal study on 4 study areas across the range of the owl. And all 4 of these involved the long-term demographic spotted owl study areas to some extent. So that was initiated in Northern California last fall. So that was using the Willow Creek study area, which is a Northwest Forest Plan study area, and then the Hoopa Tribal study area, which is another long-term study area. So removals were actually initiated there last fall. We have 3 additional study areas, 2 in Oregon and 1 in Washington, although we haven't been able to implement those just given sequestration and furloughs and things like that, but we're looking to get those off the ground next year. And the idea behind these studies is to do a very rigorous experiment to say, okay, what is the effect of removing barred owls on spotted owl populations? How does it affect survival? How does it affect reproduction? How does it affect the rate of population growth? And then also to evaluate how effective is removal at improving those, and how hard or easy is it to implement a removal project? And then, kind of secondarily to that, how much repeat effort do you have to maintain over time to keep barred owl populations at a level where spotted owls can increase and then persist over time? So it's underway.
The timeline is kind of undetermined. It's a kind of experiment at this point.
The experiment is a 4-year experiment, although analyses will be done every year, so we will have, with each year of data, we will have some indication of how it's proceeding.
And, hey, let me add to that. And then, depending on the outcome of that experiment, if a decision is made to proceed with some sort of management, then that would require us going through a sort of NEPA process like we did for actually this experiment as well. But so if there is a management decision made to proceed versus the science was unclear or we don't know whether it would really be worth it, it will have to go through that process. So it's still, targeted management is still at least 6 years out for doing it on a scale that would have a sort of a landscape level impact. And that's just because, as you said, moral issues aside or whatever, the ethics of this combined with the cost and the logistics make it, a really difficult thing to do at that scale in any kind of time frame, a quick time frame.
There's a nice article on it in the Wildlifer just a few months ago from a biologist down in Northern California who's been doing some implementation, so Google it, it's a good read.
Well, that was just kind of what I was going to say. I was wondering if there's other examples other than Green Diamond on private land where they've got their own barred owl removals underway, or if that's the only one.
The Green Diamond one was the only one on private land. British Columbia has been doing something similar just north of the border where they had very few spotted owls remaining on the landscape, and they brought those into captivity and started a captive breeding program. But they had also implemented some removal in areas they were looking at reintroducing them, and found similar results to Dennis in that Dennis works up in that area, so I was thinking of Dennis Rock as one person who is familiar with that work. And when Lowell removed barred owls from an area, he quickly found that spotted owls he hadn't seen in years came back. British Columbia found something similar. So even though they had thought the spotted owls in that area were all gone, there were some that they had not seen for many years. Lurking, yeah.
They're lurking. They're calling very quietly. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll...
There's one up there.
Oh, sorry.
Brendan and Jim, there's a perception out there that treating owl habitat in stands 90 to 120 years old may be beneficial for spotted owls, even though maybe some of the PCEs are already there. Can you provide some feedback on that, of guidelines or suggestions if we do decide to go in and treat for other reasons, maybe ecological, in those older stands?
When do you want to repeat that question as you tackle it?
Let's see. So in stands, you said, I'm sorry, 90 to 110 years old? 90 to 120. Are there where treatment might be beneficial for spotted owls?
Well, it's considered suitable habitat.
Right.
It's critical habitat.
Okay.
It does have some of the PCEs. However, there could be other ecological reasons for going in there, or other reasons besides really spotted owl habitats. Would you address that?
This sounds like a loaded question to me. I already fell for a different loaded question earlier today. I didn't know it was loaded until I talked to somebody at the break and then realized it. Well, which makes me want to give the microphone over to Jim. You know, here's the hard part. A lot of this depends upon the existing stand conditions, and I have no familiarity with that right now because I haven't seen it, I don't know it. So it makes me nervous about trying to answer a question about something I don't have that familiarity with. If you can make a case that there's, you know, if you're going to go in and treat a stand at that age level, and there's going to be a short-term impact, but you can demonstrate there's going to be a long-term benefit, I would say that's something that we might consider, and when I say might consider, might be consistent with our recommendations, either in the recovery plan or the critical habitat rule. If you're going to have a long-term setback, that's not something that seems like what we would be advocating for. And I'm using a lot of really fuzzy language there, and I apologize for that. But I mean, does that make sense, though?
A little bit.
Okay.
Can I add to that?
It's okay with me if Jim doesn't mind letting Jan answer that. Go ahead.
I think that's a really good question. Not all suitable habitat is weighed the same. And so recommendation would be is to evaluate that stand that is of interest to your unit relative to the known owls, relative to the abiotic position of that stand. Is it up on the ridge? Is it down near the creek, down near the draw? Is it on the lower slope position? Is it on a south face that really historically may have been a more open stand condition and would be more resilient to fire if it were more open kind of thing? So the projects that I've been working on, I mean, it was in suitable habitat. I couldn't say that owls would not use that, but I could say that compared to other habitats, it was of much lower value because of those slope positions or the condition of those stands, because there were some big trees scattered throughout a lot of those units. It just was overall, just really reflected that fire suppression effect.
Did you want to say something too, Jim? Oh, Brent?
Well, yeah, I guess on a project like that, what would your purpose and need be? See, that goes both ways here.
Well, then we're opening a bigger can.
Uh-oh.
Because it comes.
Come on down.
It comes into that gradient. Well, is it suitable habitat right now? Yes. Is it on a natural trajectory to being better suitable habitat? Yes. Can we accelerate it? I couldn't answer that.
Okay.
You know, I could not answer that.
But is that the goal? Would your purpose and needs statement essentially be we're trying to accelerate the development of spotted habitat?
It could be one of those objectives.
Okay.
But when it's not for an owl reason, then we start hearing these, well, it's for ecological and stand resiliency, and it's for other ecological reasons. And so that's where I see the path start dividing between owl habitat and other ecological reasons. So the stand diversity, getting different species of trees in that stand, you know, other silvicultural reasons for going in there that might not be for spotted owl.
Right.
Yet we're in critical habitat.
Right.
And we're in Forest Service AMA, which at one time, before it was critical habitat, were areas that we did different treatments in.
Right. A lot of this, I think, comes back to what Bruce was saying, is call a spade a spade. I mean, if it's for one reason, call it for that reason. And don't take some other path just to make it sound more palatable if that's not what it's really all about. And again, I'm kind of operating in the dark here, so I don't want to.
So I think someone said this morning that if your purpose and need is timber product, that can be appropriate in the CHU. There's just some considerations you would want to make to try to ameliorate the effects. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, we don't call it a restoration if it's really
Don't call it a restoration.
for timber generation, realizing that timber generation is part of the mandate. But if you're going to do that, then try and make it as, you know, ecologically palatable, valuable, progressive as you can in terms of using ecological forestry techniques. But I mean, my example was if you wanted to generate some high-quality early sterile habitat, and that was your goal, don't go to the 90 to 120-year-old stand. Go to the 20-year-old stand and do it there.
One more question, short one, then we need to honor folks' time. So, can you do a short one?
Yeah, it'll be short.
Okay.
As
So use of HRV as a template. I think a couple of you had that in your planning and analysis processes. What do you think about climate change?
Well, we've had some arguments on the ID team as to which way it might go, because some parts of the world are going to get drier and some parts are going to get wetter. And so we're certainly going to look at a warmer, drier condition for the sake of discussion. It'll be a line officer's decision how much weight to put on our proposed, our alternative that might address that.
I think maybe I would give this credit to Sue. I think there's another term out there, the future range of natural variability, given the changes we're likely to see. And if you can try and define what that is and shoot for that, you might be better off than historic range.
Paul Hesburgh.
Paul Hesburgh. Via Sue.
That's who I stole it from.
Fair enough.
All right, well, help me thank all of the speakers who were on the hook up here.
Or how about a hand for Cheryl? This wouldn't be possible without all of her work. Thank you, Cheryl.